I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
Rain worked Broad Street to a dull shine, and I sought refuge in the bookshop with its familiar scent of paper and quiet ambition. Near the till, a clerk had activated a small speaker from which issued the gravelly tones of Sir Julian Harbury, now domesticated into an abridged audiobook of his posthumous collection. The voice carried that unmistakable Oxonian timbre, yet something in the cadence troubled me. Not the words themselves, but the spaces between them. Each ellipsis felt surgical, as though a life had been spliced mid-breath. Harbury's voice would begin a line with characteristic hesitation, then fade into nothingness where surely more words had once lived. I found myself both soothed by the rhythmic cadence and faintly irritated by these calculated omissions, sensing that something essential had been lost in whatever editorial process had transformed the poet's final testament into this abbreviated ghost. The clerk mentioned that the abridged version had been prepared by St. Simeon's new audio archive project, designed to preserve only the most essential elements. Essential, I thought, according to whom? Even sincerity has a clumsy music. An editor composes in a separate key, and it showed in the way silence behaved like a man clearing his throat outside a door he would not open. Beside the till lay the Oxford Mail, folded to reveal its letters page. An anonymous correspondent described, with unsettling precision, a recurring dream. A man who dies without noise in a room of old wood, accompanied by the bell of St. Simeon's chiming thrice and a line of poetry that seemed slightly wrong. I noticed the writer had used dreamed where most of us would have written dreamt. A small thing, but small things betray their schooling. I read the letter twice, hearing the theatre in it. Thrice, like Macbeth's superstitious arithmetic, and Providence capitalized, and no names for anyone. Dreams that want to be believed usually arrive humble. This one arranged itself for performance. I folded the paper carefully, slipping it into my coat pocket alongside the day's crossword, where one clue remained untouched. Oniric prophecy, 7 letters. The answer perched in my mind like a bird on a damp wire, perfectly balanced, refusing flight. Later, in The Eagle and Child, nursing a half-finished pint that had settled into itself, I contemplated the persistence of dreams and their curious tendency to abridge what hurts most. We remember fragments, a voice, a gesture, the quality of light through a particular window, while the connecting tissue of experience dissolves like morning mist. Dreams abridge out of cowardice, not mercy. They give you emblems so you can live with them, a bell that rings thrice in a city with too many bells to count. A room of old wood in a town built from it, a death without noise, because noise makes claims. At the window, a couple spoke, with the courtesy of those who have finished arguing years before. Harbury's abbreviated cadence overlaid the clink of glass in my memory, respectable as a black tie at a wake. I told myself that abridgment might be a species of kindness. It sounded plausible if I watched the rain and did not examine the face of anyone I'd once loved. The telephone's insistence finally demanded attention. Strange announced himself in the cheerful voice men adopt for bad news. There had been an unexplained death at St. Simeon's College, he informed me, connected to their new audio archive project. A young fellow on the staff, found in their converted studio, where he ought to be and yet not as he was. I took the crossword and the letter for company. Outside, the rain had finally relented, and bells sounded somewhere unfashionable, twice and then once, as if rehearsing belief. St. Simeon's College possessed that particular smugness of small Oxford institutions, the satisfied air of a place that compensated for modest endowments with impeccable polish. The porter's lodge exhaled beeswax and accumulated cleverness, while rain-darkened stones in the cloister wore their antiquity like a well-tailored coat, neither ostentatious nor apologetic. The old chapel had surrendered its sacred purpose to the Harbury Archive, with a sort of dignified resignation Oxford buildings master over centuries. Gothic windows now framed acoustic panels, and where communion once occurred, mixing desks arranged themselves with electronic precision. The transformation felt both practical and faintly blasphemous, as though prayers had been replaced by a different species of devotion entirely. Felix Marrow occupied the crossing, slumped over his equipment with the peculiar privacy death confers. A gifted but insolent sound engineer, Lewis informed me, known equally for extracting poetry from reluctant voices and making colleagues feel intellectually inadequate. Chemical solvents stood uncapped near his workstation. Bottles for cleaning tape heads and dissolving adhesive, while the ventilation fan above remained mysteriously silent, its chain resting against painted wood like an abandoned bell pull. The scene mirrored the anonymous letter's dream with unsettling precision, a man dying without noise in a room of old wood. I examined the fan's switch plate, noting how dust had been wiped into suspicious tidiness around the edges, the sort of conscientious cleaning one performs when fearing to leave traces. On the table, a faint ring suggested where a third bottle once stood. Absent things have shapes if one possesses patience. The cast assembled like players in a particularly cerebral tragedy. Professor Arthur Leland arrived first, wrapped in tweeds that had outlived their weaver, carrying himself with the brittle grandeur of someone defending territory that no longer existed. He spoke of Felix's editorial liberties with Sir Julian's recordings, mentioning that brilliance excused much, but not everything, that Shakespeare would have understood such artistic temperament. I observed that Shakespeare understood expenses poorly, earning a look of practiced resignation. Dr. Helena Voss directed the audio project with Teutonic efficiency, her English precise as clockwork and equally unforgiving. She explained technical procedures with the patience reserved for the mechanically illiterate, noting that Felix had been preparing the final abridgment of Harbury's more personal recordings. Her accent transformed certain words into small architectural structures built to outlast their English equivalents. Beatrice Crowther, the college librarian, possessed a voice carrying the crystalline quality of someone who reads poetry aloud to empty rooms. She had discovered the body that morning, arriving early to catalogue archive materials. When discussing Felix, something in her tone suggested familiarity, extending beyond professional courtesy, a careful modulation that spoke of shared confidences. Callum Pearce appeared in expensive tweeds, his gleaming Jaguar parked conspicuously near the studio entrance. His talent for creative accounting had secured the archive's funding, and he discussed budgets with suspicious enthusiasm. He mentioned, almost casually, that Felix had been asking awkward questions about certain financial arrangements. Sister Eve Maitland, warden of the adjoining convent, moved through the space with quiet authority. Once academic herself before choosing different scholarship, her faith possessed an iron gentleness that made conversation feel confessional. She alone seemed genuinely grieved rather than merely inconvenienced by Felix's death. I listened more than spoke, allowing the room's atmosphere to instruct. Near Felix's workstation lay a crossword, half completed. He had written prophet, where the clue clearly demanded oracle. 7 letters, Unric prophecy. A small error, but one suggesting either carelessness or the distraction that comes from hearing uncomfortable truths. The bell of St. Simeon's chimed twice as we worked, not quite on any hour, not quite anywhere predictable. I felt the anonymous letter rustle in my pocket like a disapproving witness. Dreams, I reflected, can be lazy plagiarists, but they rarely clean up after themselves with such methodical precision. Beginning with the living seemed the natural course. The dead possess infinite patience, while guilt grows restless under scrutiny. Lewis arranged our interviews in the senior common room, where mahogany had been polished by centuries of academic discourse into something approaching mirror darkness, and the air carried the accumulated weight of old arguments. Professor Leland received us with ceremonial dignity, settling into his chair as though preparing to hold court. When discussing Felix's editorial presumptions, he quoted Larkin with casual authority. "What will survive of us is love," and my eyebrow performed its involuntary correction. The actual line speaks of what survives being love, not love itself. Surviving, a distinction that transforms sentiment into something considerably more complex. I offered no amendment. People reveal themselves most clearly through their unconscious alterations of poetry. Leland described Felix as technically gifted but lacking proper reverence, someone who treated Sir Julian's recordings as raw material rather than sacred text. The young man had questioned certain editorial decisions, particularly regarding passages dealing with Julian's more personal confessions. "Brilliance without reverence," Leland observed, as though reverence were earned through appropriate suffering rather than mere intelligence. Dr. Voss provided her timeline with Germanic precision, each detail weighed before delivery. She bristled perceptibly when I inquired about Sir Julian's recently altered will and the funding channeled through Pierce's office. Such matters were administrative rather than artistic. She informed me with dismissive efficiency that suggested uncomfortable familiarity with the subject. Her English constructed meaning like architectural projects, solid, methodical, unforgiving of imprecision. She had worked late the previous evening, reviewing Felix's final edits. He had seemed distracted, asking peculiar questions about financial arrangements and making marginal notes where notes did not belong. Technical people often developed obsessions beyond their competence, she observed, and I wondered whether she included police inspectors in that category. Beatrice Crowther spoke of Felix with careful modulation, but when describing their collaboration, she slipped into past tense too quickly before correcting herself with obvious discomfort. He had was, she amended, particularly gifted at extracting emotional nuance from recordings. The correction tugged at the air between us like a confession half-spoken. In the quad afterward, I noted the registration of Pierce's gleaming Jaguar, OXF 73R, which I had observed the previous evening on Walton Street, positioned near the studio entrance well after normal hours. License plates function as accidental witnesses. They announce presence where presence might prefer anonymity. Sister Eve received us in the convent's parlor, her hands folded in that perpetual prayer position some religious adopt as naturally as breathing. She recalled Sir Julian's penitential visits during his final years, seeking not absolution, but reduction. He wanted less of himself preserved, she murmured, as though preservation were burden rather than gift. Less is not always mercy, I responded, thinking of the anonymous letter and its deliberate misuse of dreamt instead of dreamed. The distinction seemed increasingly significant when considered alongside Dr. Voss's mention of preparing materials for American publication. Someone had adopted foreign conventions while maintaining domestic knowledge, the sort of linguistic disguise requiring both education and calculation. Sister Eve nodded with the understanding of someone who had spent decades distinguishing genuine penitence from mere regret. Julian had been tormented by things he could not undo and words he could not unspeak. The archive represented his attempt at controlled confession, preserving only what deserved preservation, editing his life into something approaching virtue. Walking back through the cloister, I reflected on the day's accumulating details. A misquoted poet, a slip into past tense, a car positioned like guilt outside confession. The anonymous letter rustled in my pocket, its careful Americanization now seeming less accident than artifice. Somewhere in the careful spaces between what was said and what was meant, Felix Marrow's death was beginning to acquire the shape of intention. Back at the station, the air carried that particular dampness of wet wool surrendering to reluctant radiators. A coffee mug abandoned beside the duty board had formed its own tide line, thin as regret and twice as permanent. I requested the anonymous letter from evidence, receiving it in one of those transparent wallets that transform private correspondence into public exhibit, like pressing flowers between glass. I read it first for content, as one reads a prescription or a death notice. The writer described a recurring dream with theatrical precision. A man dying quietly, as though put on mute in a room of old wood. The bell of Saint Simeon's chiming thrice. A sense of providence arranging tragedy with deliberate care. The narrative possessed that peculiar combination of intimacy and performance that marks confession, seeking audience rather than absolution. Then I read it again for its music, listening to the voice behind the words. Tiny Americanisms peppered the text like grit under the eyelid, program instead of program, color without its dutiful hue, and that insistent dreamed where any proper English dreamer would have written dreamt. Yet alongside these foreign conventions appeared fussy hyphenations that belonged to no newspaper style. Beatles, recorded, con-science. Someone had learned to disguise their voice through adopted spelling while retaining their own pedantic punctuation habits. The hyphenations suggested typewriter discipline, the old necessity of breaking words when space runs short and compromise begins. But more than that, they carried the particular precision of library cataloging, where text must fit predetermined spaces and every syllable receives careful consideration. Someone accustomed to processing words as objects, arranging them with institutional efficiency. The letter spoke of thrice the bell in language borrowed from Macbeth via parish bulletin, describing death with cinematic clarity, yet strangely unoriginal phrasing. Yet St. Simeon's bell chimed with Oxford's characteristic anarchic precision, sometimes twice, often once, following no schedule that would permit such theatrical prophecy. Someone had imposed fictional order on the city's genuinely chaotic timekeeping. I recalled Beatrice Crowther saying of Felix that he would have chosen silence, a phrase that had sat wrongly on my tongue when she spoke it. Too carefully constructed, too precisely balanced between sympathy and judgment. The same meticulous artifice now seemed to echo through the letter's calculated vocabulary, as though both had emerged from the same rehearsing mind. Strange interrupted with his characteristic blend of efficiency and impatience. The coroner favored accidental death, he reported. Chemical fumes, inadequate ventilation, tragic conjunction of circumstances requiring minimal paperwork. Lewis, with admirable faith in coincidence, preferred unfortunate accident enhanced by poor timing. Both explanations satisfied official requirements while leaving private questions carefully unexamined. When the telephone quieted, I returned to the letter's physical presence, tilting it toward the fluorescent light until faint impressions emerged like developing photographs. There, pressed into the paper's fiber, lived the ghost of a library stamp, circular, institutional, bearing partial letters I could almost identify. The impression suggested someone had composed this theatrical prophecy on a desk where books received their bureaucratic blessing, leaving fossil evidence of their professional habitat. The partial letters spelled something approaching Simeon's, though the image remained tantalizingly incomplete. Library stamps pressed deep enough to leave impressions on subsequent papers. Whoever had written this dream confession had done so surrounded by the institutional apparatus of literary preservation. Outside, Oxford's bells chimed with their usual disregard for fictional necessity, not thrice, not twice, but in that irregular symphony that marked genuine time rather than dramatic convenience. The anonymous letter rustled slightly as I folded it, a sound like distant applause for a performance whose audience remained carefully hidden. In my notebook, I wrote a single word: cataloguer. The crossword clue from yesterday flickered in memory. Oniric prophecy, 7 letters. The answer had been dreamer, but perhaps prophet would have served equally well. Lewis arrived with that particular satisfaction of a man who had persuaded reluctant documents to confess their secrets. The station's morning air carried yesterday's cigarette ghosts and the faint optimism of disinfectant applied before dawn. We spread Pierce's elegant ledgers across my desk like evidence of a crime against arithmetic itself. The bursary records revealed their story in Pierce's disciplined handwriting, each figure placed with the precision of someone who understood that money, properly arranged, could tell any story its keeper required. Grant, money from Sir Julian's altered will, flowed into the audio project with bureaucratic regularity, yet several substantial sums had come to rest in a holding account, labeled simply editorial contingency. The amounts suggested patience rather than desperation, thousands distributed across months with the careful timing of someone who understood that auditors notice sudden absences more readily than gradual erosions. What troubled me more than the missing money was the marginalia. 2 different inks marked the same afternoon's entries, black ink that decided, then blue that apologized. The sort of correction that suggested second thoughts arriving after first actions, like guilt developing its own handwriting. The laboratory's report arrived by fax with characteristic precision and disappointment. Residue on the ventilation switch contained traces of cleaning solvent, the same chemical Felix had been using on his equipment. Someone had wiped the switch carefully, removing fingerprints while leaving behind evidence of their caution. The irony possessed its own bitter poetry, attempting to eliminate traces while creating new ones. Studio access logs showed Felix entering at 1812, departing briefly for a cigarette, then returning without further electronic record. The old key, retained after the chapel's conversion, could render such systems meaningless. Progress, I reflected, always keeps a trap door for nostalgia. Discreet inquiries placed Pierce's Jaguar on Walton Street during Felix's estimated time of death, its registration captured by a traffic camera with mechanical indifference. The timeline assembled itself with satisfying completeness, a bursar with financial secrets, a victim who asked inconvenient questions, opportunity created by institutional keys, and after-hours access. Following Pierce to the Trout that evening, we observed his ritual of solitary dining. He occupied his usual table with the authority of men who believe furniture prefers their company, performing the careful choreography of someone dining alone by design rather than circumstance. The inn's register revealed his name paired with an anonymous client for a conveniently timed 2-hour dinner. The guest appeared simply as J. Smith, a fiction so transparent it bordered on contemptuous. Lewis stood by the fire, allowing his coat to steam into respectability. The evidence fitted neatly, he observed, a bursar with secrets, means, and demonstrable presence at the crucial moment. I agreed with the grammar while doubting the prose. Accounts, I told him, are literature's guilty conscience, abridged to the point of fiction. Yet something in the arrangement's very tidiness disturbed me. Pierce possessed intelligence enough to recognize his own exposure. Would such a man park his distinctive vehicle like an advertisement for guilt? The evidence assembled itself too conveniently, each piece arriving precisely when needed, as though someone had arranged a treasure hunt for investigators of modest competence. On the bar's abandoned crossword, someone had struggled with 15 across. Fictional accountant, 7 letters. I, penciled Scrooge with a stub that needed sharpening, thinking of how the most elegant lies mimic truth with such precision that only a misquoted line or misplaced hyphen betrays them. Walking back along the towpath, Lewis expressed satisfaction with our progress. The case possessed balance, I admitted, but it lacked proper account. Too neat, too considerate of our need for suspects. Pierce struck me as someone who would never wipe a chain himself. He would have someone launder the cloth. The fan's polished silence suggested a different species of piety altogether. The river resumed its proper occupation of forgetting, while overhead, bells chimed with Oxford's characteristic disregard for fictional convenience. Somewhere in the careful spaces between evidence and intention, Felix Marrow's death was acquiring the shape of a performance directed by invisible hands. Winter light lay thin across the library, the kind that leaches color from bindings and leaves only the archaeology of accumulated scholarship. Beatrice unlocked the Harbury cabinet with ceremonial precision, revealing the poet's personal papers arranged like exhibits in a museum of private failure. The hinges sighed without complaint, releasing the scent of paper and quiet industry that marked these sacred spaces of literary preservation. Among school photographs showing a younger, shyer Julian, all knees and apologetic smile beneath an unwieldy blazer, lay notebooks filled with his characteristic looping handwriting. Each letter appeared coaxed rather than commanded, as though words required persuasion to emerge from whatever darkness had spawned them. The diary volumes occupied their own shelf, chronologically ordered with the obsessive tidiness of someone who believed proper filing might retrospectively impose meaning on chaotic experience. It was the diary that troubled my eye before my hand. Late volume, buckram rubbed smooth at the spine, lying open to reveal its surgical scar. One page had been excised so cleanly that only its absence betrayed the theft. No ragged edge, no gilt of fibers, just the faint nap where a blade had slipped between signature and stitch. The remaining pages showed no yellowing of exposure. This editorial surgery was recent, performed with institutional tools rather than desperate haste. Beatrice explained the archive's dual nature with professional enthusiasm that barely concealed deeper discomfort. The unedited recordings preserved Sir Julian's complete confessions, while the abridged versions offered sanitized selections deemed suitable for public consumption. We took the original tapes to a small listening room where carpeting swallowed footsteps and conscience alike. Harbury's voice approached from the distance of its own mortality, resonant and proper, almost embarrassed by what it carried. He spoke of a summer cycling incident near Port Meadow, too much speed and too little consequence. The boy didn't get up, he confessed with the smallest tremor, like glass settling in a frame. Julian had fled rather than summoning help, leaving the injured child to be discovered hours later by strangers. The victim survived but carried permanent damage, while Julian carried permanent knowledge of his own cowardice. Later, we played the abridged version. The same passage arrived with an elegant ellipsis, a tasteful silence dressed as mercy. I found myself angered by the gentility of it. Editing made the world neater than it had any right to be, transforming authentic remorse into acceptable meditation. Among the papers, a poem titled Somnus revealed its crude secret when read vertically through first letters. Lelandlied. Effective ammunition for academic gossip, particularly regarding Leland's old plagiarism scandal that had nearly destroyed his early career. The acrostic predated Felix by yours. This accusation belonged to older weather, suggesting long-nursed grievances within Oxford's intimate academic community. When we confronted Leland in his study overlooking the quad, he received the evidence with theatrical resignation. He produced his defense alongside borrowed consolation from Houseman, but delivered the poet as Milton, the hyphens separating syllables like a butler announcing unwelcome guests. I registered the performance carefully, that fussy hyphenation appearing again like a signature in an otherwise anonymous crime. Leland admitted to discovering the acrostic years ago, dismissing it as petty spite from a man who confused confession with literature. He had removed the diary page containing Julian's detailed account, not from shame, but from desire to preserve what remained of the poet's reputation. Better to be remembered for imaginary sins than actual ones, he observed, with the cynicism of someone who had spent decades managing his own compromises. The hyphenated Milton lingered in my memory, like a false note in familiar music. Leland's natural pretension ran toward Latin phrases and unnecessary subordinate clauses, not the mechanical precision of typewritten text. Someone else had been practicing his voice, adopting his mannerisms while retaining their own pedantic punctuation habits. Back in the library's medieval quiet, I turned the diary again, running my thumbnail against the edge where the blade had passed. The missing page represented more than evidence. It marked the point where preservation became performance, where truth required editing to remain bearable. Somewhere beyond the windows, the meadow lay sodden and unhistorical, while inside, the ellipses of poetry and the hyphenated pomp of scholarship formed a shape I recognized without yet naming. Under pressure, Leland offered his alibi with the theatrical resignation of someone who had spent decades defending lost causes before increasingly skeptical audiences. He had spent the evening at the Randolphs' bar, he informed us with wounded dignity, engaged in spirited debate with a publisher about the morale, indecency of literary abridgment. The conversation had grown sufficiently heated, he recalled with satisfaction, to attract disapproving glances from other patrons, a small victory in his ongoing war against editorial vandalism. From his wallet, worn thin as old leather binding, he produced a receipt whose ink had bled romantically into the surface, transforming mundane commerce into something approaching poetry. The paper bore the evening's date with mechanical precision, time-stamped during Felix's final hours, yet placing Leland safely distant from the sealed studio. I examined the document with appropriate gravity while noting that receipts, like memories, can be preserved by anyone with sufficient motivation. The hotel register displayed Leland's characteristic arthritic flourish. Letters that began with academic ambition but surrendered to tremor before completion. The barman confirmed his presence with weary patience, describing how the professor had occupied his usual corner table, declaiming about editorial barbarism while consuming sufficient whiskey to render his arguments both passionate and repetitive. Though he clearly despised Felix's editorial decisions and possessed motive rooted in wounded pride, the timeline eliminated him from direct participation with disappointing mathematical certainty. My attention drifted to other entries in the register, where different handwritings recorded the evening's transactions like signatures in a visitor's book for the temporarily displaced. Helena Voss's neat continental script appeared several lines above Leland's signature, her arrival time-stamped for earlier that afternoon, a detail she had failed to mention during our previous conversation. Her writing possessed that particular precision of someone who had learned English as architecture rather than inheritance, each letter constructed according to foreign blueprints. When pressed about her unmentioned hotel visit, Voss admitted to negotiating American publication rights with a representative from Harvard University Press. The meeting had concerned technical matters of international copyright and editorial standards, she explained with defensive efficiency. She produced the publisher's style sheet, a document that would systematically transform British conventions into American expectations. Color would lose its hue, program would shed its final me, and crucially, Dreamt would surrender to Dreamed. The style sheet explained the anonymous letter's linguistic disguise with satisfying completeness. Someone familiar with these editorial transformations could adopt American spelling while retaining their own syntactic habits, creating a voice that belonged to no particular geography. Yet the letter's fussy hyphenations suggested institutional rather than international influences, the mechanical precision of library cataloging rather than transatlantic style guides. The first red herring ripened beautifully before us. Academic rivalry, seasoned with wounded pride, opportunity enhanced by insider knowledge, and death arriving with convenient timing. Leland possessed temperament suited to literary murder, while Voss controlled the linguistic keys that unlocked the anonymous letter's disguise. Each piece fitted with theatrical precision, creating a narrative that satisfied official requirements while leaving private questions carefully unexamined. Yet I sensed the invisible prompters directing this particular performance. The evidence assembled itself too conveniently, each revelation arriving precisely when needed to advance predetermined conclusions. Someone had anticipated our investigation, preparing alibis and explanations like stage directions for amateur actors. Even genuine emotions, Leland's anger, Voss's professional anxiety, seemed somehow orchestrated for maximum dramatic effect. Walking back through Radcliffe Square, I reflected on the evening's accumulating deceptions. The crossword in my pocket remained half-finished, its most challenging clue demanding false trail in detection work. 3 words. Red herring, obviously. But the obvious answers in this case seemed designed to distract from less visible truth. Somewhere beyond the careful choreography of receipts and registers, Felix Marrow's actual killer moved with quieter purpose, leaving others to perform the necessary theater of guilt and innocence that keeps investigations properly misdirected. The rain resumed its patient work against ancient stones, while overhead, bells chimed with Oxford's characteristic disregard for fictional convenience. Sister Eve received me in a whitewashed parlor that breathed the particular sanctity of institutions devoted to permanent things. Candle wax perfumed the air with promises of devotion, while the scent of fresh bread drifted from some unseen kitchen, creating an atmosphere both ancient and reassuringly domestic. She moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had discovered that haste belonged to the world she had abandoned. An old photograph commanded attention from above the modest fireplace, an English department garden party captured in sepia tones that transformed memory into weather. Harbury appeared younger and vaguely ashamed, as though already anticipating future regrets. Leland stood positioned to one side with characteristic theatrical distance, while a woman who might have been Eve herself before religious vows smiled with desperate brightness, performing happiness for posterity's judgment. She confirmed the identification without embarrassment, explaining that her academic life had ended when faith demanded different scholarship. Julian had been a frequent visitor during his early university years, seeking not absolution, but the ritual of confession. He wanted, she said with careful precision, to curtail his sentences until only good words remained. The phrase struck me as peculiar. Curtail his sentences, as though Julian understood his life as manuscript requiring editorial intervention. Sister Eve had introduced Harbury to Beatrice decades ago, when Beatrice was merely a trainee librarian seeking guidance about preserving fragile documents. The air between those names carried weight I could feel but not yet identify, the particular density that accumulates around connections too significant for casual mention. Julian had been drawn to Beatrice's combination of intelligence and discretion, Eve recalled. She possessed the librarian's gift for making preservation feel like protection rather than exposure. Their friendship had developed slowly, built on shared appreciation for literature's capacity to transform pain into something approaching beauty. I observed how naturally Eve spoke of their connection, yet something in her tone suggested deeper currents beneath professional courtesy. The photograph seemed to hold its breath, preserving secrets with the same determined silence that permeated the room. Strange's telephone call interrupted just as I prepared to inquire about the missing diary page. The laboratory had discovered something troubling about the ventilation fan switch, he reported with characteristic bureaucratic brightness. No fingerprints whatsoever. The surface had been wiped so thoroughly that even manufacturers' handling marks had disappeared, leaving metal polished to surgical sterility. Too clean for any genuine accident, the technician had observed with professional understatement. This absence of evidence struck me as more revealing than its presence might have been. Someone had anticipated forensic scrutiny, removing not just their own traces, but every trace, creating a blank surface that announced its own artificiality. The cleaning suggested institutional thoroughness rather than desperate improvisation, the sort of methodical attention to detail that marked professional rather than passionate crime. Sister Eve noticed my distraction with perception that marked her former academic training. She asked whether I had discovered something troubling, and I found myself explaining the paradox of evidence eliminated so completely it became evidence of elimination. She nodded with understanding that suggested familiarity with such careful erasures. Julian always said that silence was the most honest response to most questions, she murmured. Perhaps someone had finally learned that lesson too well. The observation carried implications I was not yet prepared to examine, though I noted how naturally she spoke of silence as learned behavior rather than natural inclination. Walking back through the cloister, I reflected on the photograph's frozen moment and the connections it preserved. Somewhere in that sepia triangle of Julian, Eve, and the woman who might have been Beatrice lay geometry of motives I was beginning to recognize. The fan switch's surgical cleanliness suggested someone who understood that absence of evidence could speak louder than its presence, provided one possessed institutional knowledge to orchestrate such eloquent silence. Dreams, I reflected, might indeed be prophecy when shaped by hands accustomed to editing truth into more bearable forms. Morning arrived with Oxford's characteristic ambivalence, sky the colour of old pewter and rain pausing between commitments. I unfolded the paper at my kitchen table, where the kettle had left its perfect ring of evaporation on varnish, worn smooth by decades of similar mornings. The crossword offered its usual promise of ordered complexity, though this particular grid possessed an unsettling theme that revealed itself slowly, like developing film in chemical solution. Every answer demanded the removal of its center. Enchanted became ended, its middle letters excised with surgical precision. Harbor transformed to hour, the heart of the word simply vanished. Nightmare reduced to nighty, as though terror could be domesticated through abbreviation. The setter had constructed a puzzle about amputation, about what remained when essential elements disappeared. Despite myself, I smiled at the coincidence. Oxford mornings possessed their own cryptic logic, delivering metaphors disguised as entertainment. Returning to the anonymous letter with eyes educated by crossword construction, understanding struck with the sudden clarity of lightning illuminating familiar landscape. The odd hyphenations that had troubled me from the beginning, Beatles, recorded, con science, concealed a secondary text, visible only when reading first and last letters of each sentence. Exactly, I realized with growing excitement, how abridged audiobooks remove narrative centers while preserving recognizable shapes. I traced the pattern with methodical precision, placing a sheet of paper over the letter and copying only the peripheral letters of each sentence. The middles vanished, the crusts preserved, and a message edged into visibility, not a sentence so much as an intention. The opening yielded DM, the second produced IT, continuing through the letter's careful architecture until the pattern became unmistakable. Someone had taught themselves to speak like a redacted document, communicating through deliberate omission. The marginal initials, previously dismissed as handling marks, now resolved themselves with crystalline clarity. BC. Beatrice Crowther had signed her theatrical prophecy in the margins, confident that investigators would read content while ignoring construction. The closing postscript dreamed, didn't he? Suddenly sounded aggressively pointed rather than merely curious. Not a question seeking information, but a statement demanding acknowledgement, the sort of loaded inquiry that carries its own answer. I replayed her phrase about Felix choosing silence, hearing its artificial construction clearly now. The careful balance between sympathy and judgment, the precisely modulated tone that suggested rehearsal rather than spontaneous reaction. She had prepared her. Responses like catalogue entries, each emotion filed under appropriate headings for efficient retrieval. The letter's Americanization matched Voss's mentioned style sheet perfectly, but Voss would never disguise her accent in print. Her foreignness was armor, not liability. Beatrice, however, as librarian positioned between house styles, possessed the technical knowledge to adopt American conventions while retaining her own syntactic habits. She moved between editorial worlds with professional fluency, understanding how spelling could disguise voice while hyphenation revealed character. Examining my notebook with renewed attention, I discovered what should have been obvious from the beginning. Pressed into the letter's margin lay the faint impression of Saint, Simeon's library stamp. Not approximately, not similarly, but with mechanical precision that admitted no doubt. She had composed her dream confession at her own desk, surrounded by the institutional apparatus of literary preservation, using tools designed to authenticate rather than conceal. I had been reading the killer's handiwork for days, admiring its literary sophistication while missing its practical confession. The anonymous letter was neither prophecy nor coincidence, but advertisement, a careful performance designed to establish her presence in the narrative while directing suspicion toward more obvious candidates. She had murdered Felix with librarian's methodology, removing him from the narrative as efficiently as she edited uncomfortable passages from Sir Julian's recordings. The morning's crossword theme proved prophetic in ways its setter could never have intended. Sometimes, removal of centers reveals essential truths, like prayers stripped of their comfortable middle passages to expose what actually demands belief. Outside, bells chimed with Oxford's characteristic disregard for fictional convenience, while I folded the letter with unnecessary care, finally understanding the face that emerged when the middles fell away. Duke Humphrey's library possessed that particular sanctity where even guilt learned to lower its voice. Among the chained books and medieval silence, I arranged the evidence before Beatrice like pieces of an intricate puzzle whose solution would destroy rather than illuminate. Winter light lay thin across oak darkened by centuries of scholarly devotion, while dust hung with patient reverence in the still air. She received me at her usual desk with the composure of someone who had spent decades cataloging uncomfortable truths. Her hands rested folded before her, displaying that pale crescent on her thumb where the library's inking pad left its regular benediction. When I placed the anonymous letter between us, she rotated it slightly until the faint impression of Saint Simeon's stamp aligned with the table's watermark, an instinctive correction that betrayed habits deeper than conscious thought. I explained how the hyphenated words concealed their secondary text, how the marginal initials spelled her name with institutional precision, how the library stamp's impression had betrayed the desk where theatrical prophecy was composed. The diary page lay beside the letter, its surgical absence more eloquent than whatever Julian's confession had once contained. She had removed his detailed account of the cycling accident, I suggested, preserving only the version she could bear to remember. She listened with the courtesy librarians reserve for patrons presenting damaged materials, regretful but unsurprised by evidence of careless handling. The sealed studio presented its final testimony, chemical solvents uncapped with deliberate precision, ventilation fan disabled through methodical intervention, Felix discovered stupefied by drink and diminished hope in those early hours, when conscience traditionally arrives to collect its debts. She didn't weep or protest. Instead, she explained with library-trained precision that Felix had discovered, among Julian's unabridged recordings, the complete confession about the cycling accident near Port Meadow. He intended to publish everything, not from malice, but from that species of integrity that mistakes exposure for honesty. His silence, she informed me quietly, had acquired a price she could not afford to pay. The dream letter had been composed as warning rather than prophecy, she admitted. She hoped to frighten Felix toward discretion, creating anonymous pressure that might preserve Julian's carefully edited reputation. When subtle threats failed, she visited the studio that final evening, finding him alone and vulnerable, already compromised by alcohol and professional disappointment. She reached for the fan switch with a cloth she had brought for cleaning tapes, turning it off rather than on. The room would finish what she could not bring herself to begin. "I thought I was preserving the sum of a life," she said with measured cadence, not merely the worst of one night. Julian deserved to be remembered for his poetry, rather than his cowardice, for the man he had become, rather than the boy who had fled from consequence. Literature, she observed, was the art of selecting which truths deserved survival. Felix had spoken so often of silence as though it were vocation, rather than void. She had simply provided him with the silence he claimed to value. She gathered the papers into a neat rectangle without claiming them, a movement so habitual it contained no plea. "What will survive of us is love," she said with familiar imprecision, the misquotation floating between us like a tired hymn. This time I offered no correction. In this cathedral of accumulated knowledge, her crime possessed the terrible logic of editorial necessity. She had simply removed an inconvenient passage from the text of Julian's remembered life. Outside, rain resumed its patient work against medieval glass, while the chained books maintained their vigil over knowledge too dangerous for casual handling. The evidence would speak its own language in court, but here, surrounded by centuries of preserved wisdom, I understood that some silences serve mercy better than revelation ever could. She had murdered to preserve a fiction, then confessed to preserve a different kind of truth entirely. Strange arranged what bureaucracy demanded with characteristic efficiency, transforming human tragedy into manageable paperwork through forms that resembled moral geometry, all straight lines and measured angles. He spoke of reports and official statements with the satisfaction of someone who understood that paperwork outlives guilt, that justice required proper filing systems to distinguish resolution from mere conclusion. Lewis maintained subdued professionalism throughout, affected not only by the case's resolution but by my own visible melancholy. He had learned to recognize the particular weight that settled when solutions arrived without satisfaction, when understanding brought no consolation beyond its own cold accuracy. He offered tea with wordless concern, then retreated to allow the air its necessary settling. Pierce's missing funds proved disappointingly mundane upon examination. Timing discrepancies and compliance issues rather than embezzlement, the sort of creative accounting that kept small colleges dancing between solvency and scandal. His elegant ledgers had told slightly abridged versions of financial truth, institutional fiction containing just enough reality to satisfy auditors. He would receive stern letters and quiet demotion, his career merely curtailed rather than ended. Leland, wounded but resilient, would survive to quote himself to steadily diminishing audiences. His theatrical dignity remained intact despite temporary inconvenience of suspicion. The hyphenated pomposity that had marked him as suspect would continue marking his lectures, unchanged by proximity to genuine tragedy. He would transform brief notoriety into polished anecdotes, academic martyrdom gleaming with rehearsed indignation. Voss would publish her abridged American audiobook according to schedule, enduring predictable reviews about editorial omissions and cultural appropriation. Critics would debate posthumous editing ethics while purchasing sufficient copies to justify moral indignation. Her professional reputation would survive enhanced, perhaps by association with scandal sufficiently distant to confer interest without damage. Sister Eve would continue her prayers, as she had been doing, more or less, throughout. Her faith possessed medieval stone's durability, weathered by centuries of human failure, yet maintaining structural integrity. She would remember Julian with selective mercy that marked genuine compassion, preserving poetry while allowing cowardice to dissolve into time's general absolution. Walking past the trout in evening light that transformed the Thames into molten pewter, I glanced through rain-streaked windows at the guest register. Memory stirred, unexpectedly. Another evening, years before, when a different woman had signed using a married name she had lost the right to claim. The handwriting had possessed Beatrice's careful precision, institutional training that transformed personal identity into catalogued information. Tonight, I preferred not to drink. The case's resolution left me with crossword completion's particular emptiness. Satisfaction at filling spaces, disappointment at discovering puzzles contained nothing beyond mechanical logic. Felix had died for preserving a dead poet's reputation, murdered by someone who confused editing with mercy. In the car park, license plates gleamed like minor epiphanies under sodium lighting, each certain of its letters, each oblivious to how easily those same letters rearranged into other, truer words. Anagrams, like murders, revealed how familiar elements could be repositioned to create entirely different stories. The evening crossword waited in my coat pocket. 7 across demanded what remains after editing plural. But walking through Oxford's ancient streets, I understood some mysteries resist such tidy solutions. The red threads of motive and method had been arranged into acceptable patterns, leaving only untidy questions about whether justice and mercy could occupy the same paragraph. Beatrice had murdered to preserve Julian's edited life, then confessed to preserve her own unedited truth. Somewhere in that careful space between what was preserved and what was excised lay the geometry of human devotion, too complex for any crossword's neat squares. The bells chimed with Oxford's characteristic disregard for fictional convenience, while I counted license plates like verses, the gaps between numbers performing most of the speaking. Alone in my flat, I surrendered the evening to its proper occupation of quiet reckoning. The gas fire offered companionship without conversation, its blue flames dancing with the restless energy of thoughts that refuse proper settlement. Rain worked the windows with patient insistence, each drop carrying Oxford's accumulated melancholy toward drains that had swallowed centuries of similar sorrows. Harbury's abridged voice emerged from the small speaker with ghostly authority, each pause pressed like blotting paper over the poet's worst sentences. The ellipses arrived with surgical precision, transforming confession into something approaching respectability. If I were a kinder man, I might believe in such merciful editing, the notion that lives benefit from careful revision. As it stands, I believe sentences should earn their full length through honest completion, that truth possesses its own music requiring no conductor's intervention. The day's final crossword waited beside cooling tea, its grid offering the false promise of problems with definitive solutions. 8 across demanded recorded dream about crime, shortened. I penciled Abridged with a stub that needed sharpening, finding bitter satisfaction in how the answer had haunted this entire case. The setter had thought himself clever. Perhaps he was. The word filled its predetermined spaces with mechanical precision, yet somehow the grid felt less complete rather than more. From the flat below, opera drifted through walls that preserved privacy while permitting loneliness to circulate freely. A not quite Verdi aria faded before its proper cadenza, the soprano's voice curtailed by someone who preferred emotion in measured doses. Another abridgment, another omission, another piece of beauty denied its natural conclusion. Oxford specialized in such truncated offerings. I thought of Beatrice descending stone stairs in early morning light, carrying both a librarian's professional duties and a murderer's permanent memory. She would catalogue books with the same methodical precision she had applied to eliminating Felix, her hands steady despite their knowledge of what editing could accomplish when extended beyond mere text. The library would continue its ancient work, each volume receiving care from someone who understood intimately how easily narratives could be reduced to silence. Julian Harbury had desperately wanted less of himself to survive posterity's judgment, seeking reduction rather than expansion of his literary estate. He had confessed his worst moments, hoping they might be excised from Reputation's final draft. Instead, his desire for editorial mercy had created conditions for actual murder, transforming metaphorical death into literal conclusion. The irony possessed its own terrible poetry. Pierce would continue his creative accounting, Leland his theatrical quotations, Voss her precise translations between languages and cultures. Sister Eve would maintain her prayers with medieval persistence. Each would carry forward their portion of this story, edited according to personal necessity and professional requirement. The opera concluded without fanfare, replaced by silence that carried its own eloquence. Outside, Oxford's bells chimed with characteristic disregard for fictional convenience, marking time that moved according to no narrative requirement. The crossword lay completed, yet somehow the evening felt unfinished, as though crucial clues remained hidden in margins I had failed to examine. Closing my eyes, I reflected on the case's central irony, the one that would outlive all our careful documentation and official resolution. Someone had dreamed of the crime before it happened, composing anonymous prophecy that had guided our investigation like invisible thread through an elaborate maze. The letter had masqueraded as prediction while functioning as confession, theatrical performance that revealed more truth than its author intended. Yet afterward, I understood with certainty that, settled like evening fog, the crime would dream eternally of him, of Felix Marrow, silenced in a room of old wood, his death becoming the permanent ellipsis in Julian Harbury's carefully edited life. Some omissions, I reflected, create their own indelible presence, haunting the spaces where words once lived with the persistence of unfinished music. The pencil stub finally surrendered, its graphite exhausted by the day's accumulated solutions.